When folks picture Australian money, they usually think of iron ore giants, media moguls, or maybe some flashy tech founders. But that snapshot is way off. The real economic bedrock down under isn't loud. It's quiet. It's built on pure endurance. Buried deep in the country's foundation is a network of wealthy families that were pulling strings long before the rest of the world caught on. These folks didn't show up with trust funds or a Rolodex. They hit Australian shores carrying trauma, loss, and a desperate need to survive. We're talking refugees, fleeing war, persecution, and dirt-poor conditions. Australia wasn't the dream destination. It was the Hail Mary pass. And from those shaky starts, every single wealthy family here built something way stronger than cash. They built staying power. What makes these Aussie dynasties different is they played the long game. While everyone else was chasing a quick buck, these families focused on control, owning the dirt, the supply lines, the places where life actually happens. Mom-and-pop textile shops turned into retail kingdoms. A single factory morphed into an industrial titan. Empty lots became malls, skyscrapers, and whole neighborhoods that millions of people rely on daily. This isn't just a rags-to-riches tale. It's the story of how Australia was quietly rebuilt from the ground up. These families knew real wealth isn't about Forbes headlines or stock tickers. It's about assets you never sell, institutions you silently steer, and legacies that outlast the founders. Each wealthy family wove itself into the nation's DNA, economically, socially, and culturally. Over the next few chapters, we're going to break down how these families went from nobodies to absolute powerhouses, how their playbooks rewrote the Australian commercial map, and why they still call the shots today. These aren't just business case studies. These are stories about raw power. Before we jump in, quick question. Where are you watching from right now? If you're down under in Australia, type 1 in the comments. Watching from the States, type 2. Anywhere else in the world, type 3. And if you want the blueprint on how real power is built and guarded, hit that subscribe button right now, because the families we're about to expose hate being in the spotlight. People see Australia as a young nation, but the money behind it? That's ancient in spirit. Long before the modern news cycle, a quiet, wealthy family pattern started looping across the continent. The formula was always the same. Land with zero, survive on grit, then park yourself exactly where the future money has to flow. This wasn't luck, it was a calculated move. In post-war Australia, opportunity didn't knock. It hid in the ugly suburbs, the boring industries, and the cheap land. The families that made it understood the game perfectly. They didn't fight for the crowded spots, they built in the blind spots. Small businesses were just boot camp. Retail taught them cash flow, manufacturing taught them scale, but real estate, that taught them permanence. Every wealthy family eventually pivoted to assets you can't outsource, digitize, or delete. It's wild how deeply these guys embedded themselves into daily life. Malls became the town squares. Office towers anchored the skylines. Industrial parks kept the supply chains moving. Without a single billboard or slogan, a wealthy family could dictate where people clocked in, where they spent their paychecks, and how whole neighborhoods developed. This wasn't dominance by force, it was dominance by positioning. Another big key was discipline. While other entrepreneurs were burning cash to grow fast, these families played it cool. They preferred leverage over exposure. They quietly plowed profits back into the business, hated bad debt, and handed down decisions with military precision. In Australia's boom and bust economy, that patience let the wealthy family survive crashes that wiped out the loudmouths. This chapter lays the groundwork for everything else, because once survival morphs into strategy and strategy hardens into ownership, wealth transforms into power. And once that power is rooted in the dirt and the institutions, you basically can't dig it out. What really separated these dynasties from the one-hit wonders wasn't IQ or luck, it was mindset. Every wealthy family operated on a generational clock, not a quarterly earnings call. They made moves assuming someone else, maybe a grandkid not even born yet, would cross the finish line. In a fast-moving economy, that kind of foresight is a massive cheat code. Most of them figured out early that being famous is a liability. Publicity brings scrutiny, competition, and headaches from the politicians. So, a wealthy family usually chose silence over the red carpet. They dodged personal branding, ignored celebrity culture, and let their assets do the talking. While everyone else was chasing clout, they were stacking leverage. Family education mattered just as much as the bank account. The kids weren't just trust fund babies, they were trained operatives. From day one, the next generation learned how to structure a deal, why you never sell the prime real estate, and how to manage risk like a hawk. In a wealthy family, passing the torch was a deliberate process. Mistakes were fixed behind closed doors. Lessons became gospel. Australia's rules of the road rewarded this discipline, too. Long holding periods, solid property rights, and a boring legal system made it a paradise for patient money. Each wealthy family learned to work the system, not fight it. They built the right relationships, mastered their timing, and only pulled the trigger when the deck was stacked in their favor. Maybe the biggest factor was emotional control. Panic during a recession kills businesses. Arrogance during a boom bankrupts them. A wealthy family survived by keeping ice in their veins through both. They bought when nobody else wanted to touch it and sat on their hands when the market went crazy. That discipline, repeated over decades, quietly compounded into total dominance. By the time the public realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. Cities had literally grown around their land. Industries were hooked on their infrastructure. What started as basic survival had evolved into authority, deep, entrenched, and nearly impossible to challenge. As Australia matured, these dynasties hit a decisive phase: consolidation. This was where survival instincts swapped out for structural dominance. A wealthy family didn't need to prove anything anymore. The goal shifted from grow big to total control. Assets got reorganized, partnerships got cleaned up, and ownership lines were hardened to make sure their influence never fractured. One of the smartest moves here was simplification. A lot of families intentionally dumped the flashy or volatile stuff, even if it was making money. They sold off retail chains, merged factories, and streamlined the mess. What was left was a concentrated core, usually real estate, infrastructure, or long-term finance. For a wealthy family, having total control over a few massive assets always beat being spread too thin. This era also tested how they handled family drama. More money usually means more fighting. The winners put structures in place early: family offices, holding companies, and strict rules. They took emotion out of the boardroom. Beefs were squashed internally. A wealthy family that couldn't manage its own dinner table rarely survived the outside world. Another defining trait was the ability to pivot without panicking. When the economy turned, these families adjusted quietly. They refinanced instead of selling, they renegotiated instead of running away. Because they were looking at a 50-year timeline, a little short-term turbulence didn't freak them out. This flexibility let a wealthy family outlast competitors who needed constant winning just to stay afloat. By the end of this stage, something crazy happened. These families weren't just participating in the economy anymore, they were the fixtures holding it up. Their assets dictated how cities grew and where money flowed. They stopped chasing opportunities, opportunities started orbiting around them. At a certain level, wealth stops being about getting rich and starts being about staying rich. Insulation. This is where a wealthy family separates itself from the newly rich. In Australia, this looked like risk management so advanced it was invisible. They stopped asking, "How can we make more?" and started asking, "How do we make it impossible to lose what we have?" Diversification took on a whole new vibe. It wasn't about trying new things, it was about reinforcing the fortress. A wealthy family would spread its bets across connected assets, commercial buildings, housing their own retail tenants, logistics fleets moving their own goods, financial arms backing their own plays. Every piece protected the others. If one sector took a hit, another one absorbed the blow. Collapse became mathematically impossible. Finally, the ultimate cheat code shifted from ownership to access. Banks, governments, and institutions started treating these guys differently. Deals were whispered, not advertised. Financing terms were custom-tailored. Regulatory chats happened behind closed doors. A wealthy family didn't need to fight in the open market anymore. They operated in a parallel universe built on trust, history, and the kind of handshake deals you can't buy into. This stage completely rewired their emotional relationship with capital. Riches stopped being the prize and started being the instrument. Cash flow wasn't just income, it was the fuel for influence. Having liquidity meant they could afford to wait. Keeping their mouths shut preserved their upper hand. These dynasties realized that holding back often hit harder than striking out. Occasionally, the most dominant play was to stand perfectly still. A silent kind of dominance began to take shape. Trends, bad press, or sudden market shocks couldn't touch them anymore. Their roots went down too deep, and their horizons stretched out too far. By building a fortress against volatility, they turned mere success into unshakable stability, and eventually, that stability hardened into something you almost never see: true permanence. Decades down the line, these empires slipped into a mode most people miss entirely: the normalization of authority. The extraordinary became the everyday. They stopped jumping when the market twitched, like regular investors, mostly because the market started twitching based on what they did. Their portfolios turned into benchmarks, literal yardsticks, that banks and institutions used to define what stable looked like. Influence without the spotlight became the defining feature. One private meeting or a quick call could shift the fate of whole districts, industries, or workforces. But you'd almost never see their names in the paper. They knew that being seen actually weakened their grip. True power operated most effectively when it faded into the wallpaper, becoming practically inseparable from the system it controlled. The biggest threat was handing over the reins. While founders ran on gut instinct and survival mode, the next generation needed a blueprint. To fix this, families etched rules into stone that superseded any one person's ego. Systems of governance took over where charisma left off. Through voting structures, locked assets, and multi-generational mandates, they made sure no single heir could wreck decades of effort. For a dynasty like this, keeping the ship sailing mattered more than who was steering. The steady beat of Australia's economy turned up the volume on this dynamic. Extended periods of growth let patient money ripen without interference. While the get-rich-quick crowd burned out, these clans stood firm, quietly stacking gains. The awe surrounding their fortune wasn't about the dollar amount anymore. It was about how bulletproof it had become. Eventually, the scorecard changed. Success wasn't about net worth, it was about longevity. Any clan making it this far had unlocked a rare achievement, a relevance that outlasted passing fads, changing times, and even the family members themselves. They hit a ceiling where money couldn't account for their standing anymore. The new currency was the story itself. They realized that while cash buys choices, only legitimacy safeguards authority. In Australia, this sparked a quiet pivot toward managing how they were perceived, not by seeking fame, but by giving back. Charity moved from a nice gesture to a tactical play. They didn't just sprinkle money around. They targeted the pillars of society, universities, hospitals, the arts, and research lab structures designed to outlast any recession. By weaving themselves into the fabric of public life, they tied their name to progress. They became essential, even seen as the good guys, which made challenging them socially taboo. This strategy also greased the wheels between generations. The younger crowd, who never felt the hunger of the early days, needed a mission bigger than just "don't lose the money." Foundations and impact investing gave them that why. It fused ethics with survival, making sure the heirs felt the weight of duty rather than the comfort of privilege. Most importantly, this inoculated them against politics. When your fingerprints are all over civic life, attacking you causes too much collateral damage. Administrations came and went, laws changed, but these families stayed put. To cut them out would mean destabilizing the very systems everyone else relied on. Power stopped looking like personal wealth and started looking like public infrastructure. They weren't just characters in the national story anymore, they were the narrators. The desperate scramble for survival had matured into solemn stewardship, capping off a metamorphosis that very few ever managed to pull off. With their position secured, they ran into a paradox that rarely gets discussed. How do you change without breaking the machine? Stay too stiff, and you become a relic. Move too fast, and the wheels fall off. The Australian dynasties that lasted were the ones that figured out how to upgrade the software silently, without ever looking unsure or weak. Tech was treated as a utility, not a shiny toy. Instead of jumping on every bandwagon, they cherry-picked innovations, better data for asset tracking, tighter systems for efficiency, sharper analytics to spot danger. They bought into tech that tightened their grip, avoiding the kind that required endless pivots. Upgrading was about staying solid, not stroking an ego. The way they moved, money changed too. The world opened up, but they didn't rush out blindly. Investments overseas were defensive plays, usually done through partners or small stakes. The anchor remained Australia. Sticking to home turf wasn't about nostalgia, it was cold strategy. Knowing the laws, the politics, and the players inside out gave them an edge no foreign market could match. Times changed, and so did values. People demanded more transparency, and the youth started asking tough questions. The survivors were the ones who listened without handing over the keys. They updated their vocabulary and their image, but kept the core engine running exactly the same. Mastering this balance allowed them to look modern without becoming brittle. Their influence began to feel like it had always been there. They'd graduated from being rich in a specific moment to being relevant across history. That difference between having a good run and staying power is what divides a lucky break from a dynasty. The gap between these empires and regular rich became basically impossible to jump. It wasn't just about owning things or knowing people anymore, it was about inevitability. Operating at this altitude meant making assumptions nobody else could afford. Time was on their side. The system molded itself around them. Even when disruption hit, it moved slow enough for them to adjust. The biggest hidden perk was having options. While other businesses had to scramble, sell, merge, grow, or die, these families could just sit tight. They didn't need a home run every time, they just had to avoid striking out completely. That imbalance created a quiet stranglehold. Competitors were playing speed chess, while these families were playing without a timer. Handing down the legacy became a science. It stopped being about who shouted the loudest. It was about fitting the right piece in the puzzle. One heir might be the face of the brand, while another pulled strings from the shadows. Some handled the money, others handled the people. In a mature dynasty, you got the job that fit your personality, not your birth order. It kept the peace and kept the vision clear. The way they dealt with disaster was another separator. Recessions and political upheavals hit everyone. Sure, but not with the same force. With spread-out bets, low debt, and solid reputations, chaos looked like a sale. They could scoop up failing assets for pennies, rewrite contracts, or just wait for the weaker competition to fold. Their existence felt like a law of physics. Industries just assumed they weren't going anywhere. Banks built risk models based on them. City planners drew maps around their property lines. What started as a fight to survive turned into structural certainty. At this level, you don't dominate by yelling. You dominate by being impossible to evict. Ultimately, the real masterclass here isn't about cash, it's about duty. Any clan that lasts for generations knows the truth. Money without a mission implodes. Power without breaks just creates enemies. Staying power takes a balancing act, mixing hunger with humility and control with giving back. Across the continent, the families that stuck around learned to view themselves as temporary caretakers rather than absolute owners. They shielded their assets instead of draining them. They used their pull sparingly. Every choice was made knowing that the grandkids would inherit the fallout, not just the fortune. That mindset shifted the whole game from power to stewardship. The last takeaway is purely human. Behind the marble and the trust funds were real people molded by tragedy, discipline, and optimism. None of this was guaranteed. It was brick by brick, slow, and mostly quiet. The families that remember where they came from keep their feet on the ground. The ones that forget usually don't survive. If this reshaped how you view power, legacy, and the real mechanics of wealth, pass it on. Send this to someone who needs to think bigger than the next quarter. Hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the families running the world. And drop a line below which lesson really hit home for you.